Hello, it's Blue Orange 22, and I'm coming at you today with a little bit different of a video than I usually do. It's about this Reddit post here talking about the myth of male privilege in Muslim countries. You can see the title says male privilege is a myth in Muslim countries too, and here's why. And it's a very interesting, rather long post, and I'm not going to get to cover it. The OP, DemolitionMatter, thank you very much to them for making this post, talks about multiple countries here: Afghanistan, Iran, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and a lot of people who see that might think, well, what on earth? I mean, surely women are oppressed in those countries. Now, the author of this post is not denying that sexism and oppression against women in these countries exist. So he's not saying that women are privileged. That's a very important point to make. He's not saying that these countries don't have any issues with women's rights. What he's saying is kind of the same thing that MRAs in the West say, is that the situation for men in those countries is not privileged, and then he gives a breakdown as to why. And that's something that I've talked about before on this channel. I have talked about the Middle East before on this channel, but not very much. So let's get into this. Starting off, he begins with Afghanistan, where he says trafficking. Well, here's an interesting fact. Boys are more likely in Afghanistan to be trafficked than girls. They can be subject to sexual trafficking, forced labor, or being sent off as a soldier, a loophole due to the country's absence of conscription. For example, boys, often aged 13 and under, often were sexually trafficked into bakabazi or boy play, which was a custom where young boys were forced into entertainment where they danced or sang sexually as male entertainers for adult men, and raped repeatedly by their captors and his friends. And the post goes on to say more than that, but I do remember seeing that on a Vice documentary and other places as well. This forced sexual labor of boys as young as 10 years old was going on for military commanders and local community leaders. So this is something that I am familiar and that I have seen myself. Now, I'm kind of jumping around here and I'm not getting to everything because it is a very long post. I've put it in the description below if you want to read everything, which I think you should, but he goes on talking about Afghanistan in terms of murder and homicide. In Afghanistan, 87% of homicide victims are men. In fact, Afghan men and boys were killed all the time, and American media only focused on the women and children, portraying Afghan men as sexist oppressors, but these men are usually victims instead. Due to the media portraying Afghan men as evil, misogynistic terrorists, the American military killed many male Afghan civilians and assumed they were terrorists. Now, that's a little strongly worded there. I mean, almost all of the male Taliban were probably oppressors, but I kind of do understand what the author here is getting at. During the war in Afghanistan, I remember when there was a declaration from the Obama administration that all military-age men in certain areas were to be considered combatants for drone strikes and for aerial bombings. And military-age males ended up meaning anything above the age of 15 years old could be targeted and legally classified as combatants. Even if there was no evidence that they were combatants, even if there was no evidence that they had any arms on them or any weapons, they could still be drone striked and killed just for being a male 15 years old or older. So then they talk about Iran, and like Afghanistan, that's another country people would say, really? You're going to talk about men being disadvantaged in Iran? But I've talked about Iran before. Most of the Iran section was talking about Iran in the past, before the 79 Islamic Revolution. So I'll just cover a little bit of what they say, and then I'll add a few things of my own. They say that 81.9% of murder victims are men, which is similar to Afghanistan and really kind of similar to most of the world. And then they mentioned something that I wasn't familiar with. Mar, or Meher, I hope I'm saying that correctly. It says, Meher is something men have to pay women in Iran if he divorces her, and it's alimony, but on steroids. Look up about it. And I did. I looked up their two articles, and then I Googled it, and I basically found a lot of different sources for a lot of different countries, different law firms practicing this, but they all kind of said the same thing. This is something that exclusively is something that men pays to women. And I have no doubt that in Iran, it's not as equal as it is in the US in terms of earning power. But then I did find this. Iran prenups land thousands of men in jail. And that's something similar that we see in the United States. Men being, and I've done videos on this too, men being thrown into jail in the alimony cycle. And the takeaway point I always have when it comes to men going to jail for alimony is this: how privileged is a gender if they go to jail for not giving money to the oppressed gender. Does that make sense? Now, I said I'd be adding some things on Iran on my own, and here they are. The first is conscription. All male citizens in Iran are subject to 2 years of conscription, forced military service. And the other fact is one that's very interesting to me. And I think I made this point before, but 70% of engineering students in Iran are women. So 70% of university students studying STEM, math, science, and engineering. I'm not sure if it's all math and science or just engineering. It might just be engineering. But 70% of engineering students are women. That doesn't really fit the profile of a country that oppresses female students, especially in a male-dominated field. Now, I remember bringing that up in the past. That article I showed you was from 2015. I think I brought it up 8 years ago, well before this channel even existed, and I got into a debate with a feminist, and they said the reason why that statistic is because parents send their male children overseas to study in the US and the UK. I don't know if that's true, but even if it is true, the fact that Iranian universities take 70% of female engineering students, they're not really oppressing their female students, are they? Comes to Iran, just to make it very clear, obviously I know what's going on in the news right now. So I know the current government is extremely hostile, and yes, the current government is oppressing women. So what this post is not talking about what's going on right now today, but this is talking about what it's been like for men and women in these countries over the last 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And they're not denying that women don't have issues in these problems. They're not denying that women have problems in these countries. What they're saying is that when you look at the statistics, this image you have that men don't have any problems in these countries is simply not true. And the idea of this overall patriarchy that controls every facet of society and life just doesn't add up, and just also isn't accurate. Okay, so now they go and talk about Syria and Iraq, emphasizing ISIS, and this I have seen before. Basically, ISIS is much more likely to kill a male than a female. Let's take a look. Since March 2011, when the Syrian civil war began, all the way up till now, 228,647 Syrian civilians have been killed. 79.4% of them were men, 181,540 men. 6.96% were women, and 13% were children. I'm not going to have the total number amounts. You can see the percents. And many of these children probably are boys. This means that women were the least likely to be killed, and usually men are killed. In fact, of all the 5,043 civilians ISIS killed, 68.65 were men, 11.64 were women, and 19% were children. Of course, some of that 19% will be boys. Of the 200,000 civilians killed by Syrian government forces, 82.24 were men, 11.45 were children, and 5.96 were women. This means it's typically men being killed there. Within their first year following the 2014 declaration of the caliphate, ISIS had already killed 1,362 civilians, including 9 children and 19 women. This means 97.94% were men. Now, there's a large section here on Saudi Arabia, which I'm not going to go into detail. You can see it in the link below. I would encourage you to read it. There's a lot of links on different facets of Saudi society, and it essentially says that men are not as privileged and things are not as black and white as the Western media would have you think. But what I do want to look into is down below that on domestic violence, and he has some very interesting and surprising statistics, though not all that surprising if you follow the men's rights movement. There's surprisingly high rates of domestic abuse against men in the Arab countries, where way more than men and women are victims of domestic violence. There are more male victims than female victims of domestic violence in Yemen, 70% versus 19%, Libya, 66% versus 17%, Tunisia, 52% versus 32%, Palestine, 51% versus 18%, Iraq, 49% versus 17%, Jordan, 48% versus 11%, Sudan, 41% versus 25%, Algeria, 34% versus 16%. So far, this is like 2, 3, 4 times greater, 2, 3, 4 times as likely to be victims. There were more female victims of domestic violence in Morocco, 35 versus 29%, Egypt, 43 versus 26%, and Lebanon, 56 versus 18%. So the author isn't trying to hide the fact that female victims do exist, and in some countries it is worse for women. And they continue. Typically, people there get help by contacting relatives instead of police for dealing with domestic abuse. They don't often contact police unless they're in Lebanon. Yes, women come forward in Arab countries. They contact the family, and the family intervenes. It's not like in the West where you call the police. So that's all I'm going to cover from that post. There's a lot more to it than that. I just wanted to kind of give an intro and an overview of some of the main points that were talked about. I've put it in the link below. It's a very interesting and thorough post. The author put a lot of credit into it, so thank you very much for doing that. People might wonder, why would you post something about men's rights in the Middle East and in the Islamic world? I mean, is it really appropriate when the bigger problem is the things that happen to women? But the point of this post is that some of the problems aren't worse for women. And if you don't talk about the problems that happen to men and boys, like men being killed and boys being raped, which I think we can agree is something that's worth talking about, then who does talk about it? No one. So that's why we do, because nobody else does. So anyway, I'm BlueOrange22. Tell me if you like videos like this, where I review articles and posts and Reddit posts and essays and things like that. I'll do more of them if you like. So I apologize for the lighting and the sound. I'm actually overseas right now, so my internet and my studio setup is really not very good. So I'm kind of doing the best I can, and that's kind of why I've not been doing too many videos lately. I'm still scheduled for the Speaker's Corner in London on July 2nd. I'm looking forward to that, and thank you very much. Have a good summer.